Welcome to today's Expert Chat. I'm Ginny with the Understood team, and today we're going to be talking about teaching kids with dyslexia to read. Our very special guest today is Margie Gillis, who is a literacy expert and also president of the organization Literacy How. Hi Margie, how are you today?
Good, Ginny. Thank you for inviting me to do this chat.
It's great to have you here today, Margie. For our viewers, Margie will be taking your questions throughout the chat. If you have any questions for her, just type them into the chat box and we'll get to them at some point during the chat. And we can get started, Margie, right away with, I think, the best thing to do, which is to explain what is dyslexia and what isn't it.
So, dyslexia has to do with processing the sounds of language. And what we have to do sort of intuitively when we learn to read and when we learn to spell words is we have to be aware that words are made up of these little discrete sounds that are called phonemes. Some people can hear and process those sounds relatively easily, and they don't have to have that explicit instruction and understanding of that, but students with dyslexia tend to have difficulty with that task, processing those sounds. So it really has to do with auditory or phonological, what we refer to as phonological processing. What it isn't is visual processing difficulty. So because students with dyslexia often reverse letters and numbers when they write, a lot of people might be misled to believe that it has to do with how they're processing visual information, and so they might work on the visual aspect of learning to read and write. Although there is a visual component, dyslexia really isn't about visual processing per se. Okay.
And in terms of, intellectual level, how does dyslexia relate to intelligence?
It really isn't related to intelligence. So you can be extremely intelligent in dyslexic or have dyslexia or be identified with dyslexia. You can be moderately intelligent, or you can be on the low average side of intelligence. So it really does not correlate with it at all.
Mm-hmm. And, Margie, I just realized that I didn't ask you to tell our viewers a little bit more about your background. You have such a great background in the field. So before I go into the next question, would you like to tell our viewers just a little bit more about your background?
So my roots are really in special education, which is why, I guess I'm considered an expert in reading. I taught many children to read over the years, children and adults as well. And I did that for probably 20 years before going into the field of professional development, where now I spend most of my time working with teachers and embedding coaching support for them in classrooms with a team of people that work with me called Literacy How Mentors.
Okay, a fellow special education teacher, former special education teacher then.
Exactly.
It's good work.
Yeah, it is.
Right.
Very so.
All right, so from what we know, are there tried and true methods for teaching kids with dyslexia to read, Margie?
There really are tried and true methods, what I refer to as evidence-based practices. So we have research to show some of what works for the students that are really struggling learning to read, again, for some of the reasons I just mentioned. Some people call these methods multisensory, which I'll explain in a minute. Other people refer to them as structured literacy. What is at the heart of this type of method of instruction is that you're teaching the structure of the English language. So English happens to be a complex language, and so teachers need to understand how the sounds map onto the letters, how those words are spelled, for example, in English, we have a lot of words. Many of our words, over half of them, are multiple meaning words. So they're words that can be used in lots of different ways. Take a simple example, the word set. You can set the table. You can play a set of tennis. You can be all set, ready, set, go. So there's lots of complexities about English that need to be taught. So we're teaching the structure of the English language, therefore the method is called structured literacy. And so we're teaching those elements. We're also, in this methodology, we're incorporating good pedagogical practices, some of which are teaching things explicitly, teaching things systematically, teaching things to mastery. Another important component is that we're advocating for diagnostic and prescriptive teaching, which means that teachers have to be looking for what the problems are that students kind of present with, and then prescribing the right intervention to match what it is that they're struggling with. And that just takes a great deal of knowledge on the teacher's part. I'll just say one more thing about the multisensory piece, because a lot of people refer to this methodology as being multisensory. It just means that we're engaging students' senses. So we're thinking about the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic or tactile. If we're learning using all those senses, we tend to learn things better. And students with dyslexia tend to need to engage those senses to remember what they've learned.
Okay. You know, when you were talking about the different ways we can use the word set, I was also thinking about how dyslexic kids struggle with hearing vowel sounds, and for many the word set sounds so much like sit.
Exactly. You're right, Jenny. As a matter of fact, I taught in Texas for a number of years, and the students there had trouble discriminating the short E, the and the short I, which I, from Connecticut, definitely differentiate those two, but depending on your dialect, you might not hear a big difference. So that's a very good point.
Right, and in the systematic teaching of explicit phonic instruction, I know when I would teach it, we would start with the I sound, and we wouldn't get to the S sound until that was like the last vowel, because we really wanted the kids to have that I sound mastered.
Pretty well done, yep.
Yes, yes. So are schools adequately providing this multisensory, explicit, systematic reading instruction for kids with dyslexia? Do you find in the field that schools are meeting that challenge?
Some are, but most are not, I would say. And I think most are not because they just haven't had the professional development that they need. They don't have a deep understanding. There may be even some philosophical opinions about the need to teach those foundational skills really explicitly to students. So there's a great variability there, I would say.
So if a parent has a child with dyslexia, should they look into outside tutoring, whether or not the child is getting that type of needed instruction at school?
You know, I'm never going to answer the question like that as a yes or no, because it's so dependent on the situation. They shouldn't need to hire a tutor. Having said that, I had a student, a child with learning disabilities, and I hired a tutor. I mean, you do what you have to do as a parent to get the job done. And if the school isn't doing their part, then you often do have to resort to that. I would say a couple things on that front. One is, the more a parent knows and understands, not the super deep stuff that a teacher would be, required to know, but enough that they can advocate for their child, enough that they could go to a meeting and talk knowledgeably about the topic. That's very important. And being able to say explicitly why they would suggest that their child would need, let's say, multisensory structured language or structured literacy instruction, and give some data to show that. The data really is important to have, armed with that data makes a big difference. But also, to advocate for alignment, because something I see a lot is that, let's say a parent does go outside and get a tutor, and the tutor is doing a great job, but the tutor is delivering that intervention kind of in isolation, if you will. It's not matched to what the child is learning in school. So the child's hearing one thing in school and getting something else at home through the tutor. That can be very confusing, especially for a child with dyslexia. They really need to have their programs as aligned as possible. It even happens in the same school, like the kid will be getting some kind of instruction in the gen ed classroom, leave to work with Mrs. Jones, who's doing a multisensory structured literacy approach, and the two are totally disconnected. And the child is left confused and not necessarily advancing the way they should. So that alignment is very, very important. If you do hire a tutor, I recommend that you set up a call so that the tutor can talk to the teacher and make sure that that confusion isn't occurring.
Yeah, that's such a great point to bring up. Coming from public school, I am aware that that can be a problem, and that is really a critical thing to check out. Again, going back to the shorty and short I sound, if they're being taught at the same time, it's, there's not a very good chance that the child is going to master either one very quickly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So, how different is instruction for a child with and without dyslexia? Are kids in the classroom, in the general education classroom, being taught in the same way? Does that usually happen? Is the thinking changing on that in your experience, Margie?
Again, this is my limited experience in one state, but I think I have certainly talked to colleagues across the country, and I think it's fairly pervasive that most general ed settings still use level text to guide reading instruction. So, and that is guided by a process of analyzing what are called running records. And a running record is what the child says when they read a level text. A level text is a text that's leveled either with a letter or a number. It's somewhat subjectively leveled, but it's leveled in terms of sentence length and word length. And the idea is that children will move through those levels, in somewhat of a, sequential way. And that process, as I said, occurs mostly in general ed classrooms. What we know is that children with dyslexia could go through those levels and get to a point where they might stop or stall out because they've used their coping mechanisms, usually their comprehension strengths, to mask the fact that they might not be decoding those words. And because that method of instruction using level text does ask kids to, look at pictures to figure out words or see if the word makes sense in the context of a sentence, rather than first clue or cue, look at the word and decode it, children with dyslexia are not necessarily using or practicing decoding skills or even taught those decoding skills. So again, there may be this disconnect between what's happening in general ed classrooms for those students and what method is really going to be most useful for students who have difficulty with phonological processing. Again, what I spoke about earlier, which is directly related to their ability to decode words.
Right. So I've heard the terminology explicit and embedded phonics. So when we talk about texts, can you explain the difference between explicit and embedded phonics when it comes to texts?
Sure. So explicit phonics instruction would follow a sequence, and it would start with simple words like cat and sit and cup, okay? Small words that have a vowel sound in the middle that's pretty consistent, right? And then once a student can blend the sounds and read those words in those small and read those words accurately and automatically, you would move to another spelling pattern, and then you would get to mastery on that one and go to the next one and the next one. They would get increasingly more challenging, and then you would put those words, those one-syllable words together and make multi-syllable words. Okay, that's kind of the sequence that usually explicit phonics usually follows. That would be contrasted with an embedded or implicit phonics program, which is more incidental, which the teacher, when the child came to a word that they couldn't read or decode, the teacher might say, oh, that happens to be this pattern. This is what we say, or what we, how we sound it out. It's for the student who doesn't have any reading disability or dyslexia, that might work. But for the student with dyslexia, it leaves too much to chance. And they never really get to mastery on those simpler steps and the simpler words before moving to the more complicated words. And so, again, that's really an important pedagogical principle in terms of that structured literacy that I talked about earlier, that whole idea of systematic, sequential, cumulative to mastery. That's the difference, really.
So for a child with dyslexia, then he or she should be exposed then to more explicit texts.
Definitely, and thank you for saying that, because part of that explicit phonics instruction usually means that you have to have what are called decodable texts to practice. The student isn't just reading words, because if you're just reading words, first of all, it's not very interesting. That's a part of it, but you really want to read those words in text. The whole idea is getting a child to read fluently and reading text automatically. And for kids who need that explicit phonics instruction, they also need to practice with text that we call controlled. So it's controlled in that I taught them this particular pattern, and this text is going to be loaded with that pattern. So they're going to have lots of practice with that before moving to the next. And again, there's a lot of teachers that have been sort of, I don't know what the best way to say this is, like indoctrinated against the use of decodable text because it feels too controlled, it feels contrived, it's not interesting and exciting. But what I say to the teachers is, this isn't about, the focus of this isn't on comprehension, although we certainly would ask comprehension questions. But the purpose of this particular text is to build automaticity for those patterns. And the kids love it. The kids have no problem because for the first time, they can be successful reading. So they're not worried about the story that is kind of inane and not too exciting. We say to them, look, this is a means to an end. This is going to get you prepared to read, Harry Potter or whatever it is that you're interested in reading. So again, that's a really important component of that explicit phonics instruction.
Right, and I can attest to that also. Kids love being able to get through paragraphs, and, they really do feel so successful. So it's a great thing for them.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we have some questions coming in, so we're going to move to those. We talked a little bit about tutoring earlier, and we have a parent that said that his or her child was just diagnosed with dyslexia in February, but the school can't help. So she wants to know if a tutor is a good option.
Again, I think a tutor is a great option as long as you find the right tutor. So they're not all the same. So I would, say to the parent, make sure you ask what her experience and qualifications are. They definitely experience matters. So how many children have they taught, and even asking for a referral, talking to another parent who's used that tutor is not a bad idea, right? And finding out some qualifications, because I happen to be an academic language therapist. Most people in the northeast part of the country don't even know what that is. I think I'm the only person that is certified in the state of Connecticut. But there are a lot of us in Texas and the Southwest where the program was developed. Orton Gillingham is a more common certification in this part of the country. But I guess you want to ask, how much training has the person had? How much, experience and training? They both matter a lot. Okay,
great. Now, this parent is asking about a particular program, so you may or may not have heard of it, but let me just ask you if you've heard of CR Success and whether it's a program that's geared towards students with dyslexia.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah, I haven't either. So for this parent, she should probably just directly ask someone at the school, I would imagine.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, there's something called evidence-based practice, EBP. And there are some places that you can sort of look to find programs that have evidence behind them. I used to use the Florida Center for Reading Research way back 10 years ago in the Reading First Days, but actually they've updated their website. They have a new executive director, so there's a lot of good information on the Florida Center for Reading Research. It's fcrr.org. What Works Clearinghouse is also a place to look for programs that have some research behind them. And you really do want to do your homework on that, because obviously there are lots of people that claim to have research behind them. If you go to their website, oftentimes you'll see that the research was conducted by the company or the organization. So what we're really looking for to know if there's evidence behind the program is, was there some kind of outside research study that showed the benefit or the results of that approach or program?
Right. And as you say, even going to the website, if they are, particularly, if they are using the methodology for kids with dyslexia, they would probably be sure to say it.
Exactly.
It would be right up front there. Okay.
Yep.
All right. This is a very interesting question coming in, having to do with comprehension. So if kids are using their comprehension skills to compensate for decoding, can we assume that they're comprehending even though they're not reading accurately?
It's a great question, like you said, and it's a little bit complicated, but let's just say the student does have really good comprehension, and you know that because they have incredible conversations with you about, a movie that they've watched with you, or a television program, or you read a book out loud to them and you had this very deep conversation. So clearly they have good language comprehension. And what's happening when they're reading, there's a difference between language comprehension, right, that I'm listening to, versus reading comprehension where I'm having to read it and comprehend it. If you're stumbling over words, that's going to interfere with comprehension. However, what some of our very good language comprehenders and dyslexic students do, or students with dyslexia do, is they use those good, strong comprehension skills and they fill in the pieces. And it's amazing how they can do that. But they have such strong comprehension skills, they can infer. They can even infer the words a lot of times because they have good comprehension skills, they have good vocabulary skills. And that's where I was saying before that we can find these kids looking pretty good until they get to a certain grade. Often it's 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, where they can't memorize words anymore. I mean, there's too many words to memorize, and they can't compensate anymore. And they're working really, really hard to kind of hide the fact that they can't read and spell very well. And unfortunately, it's not the best scenario because we know that early intervention is easier than waiting because there's lots of fallout from waiting, right? So getting good instruction right from the get-go, and kindergarten, all kindergarten students benefit from learning how the English system works, learning how to sound words out, learning how to use those sounds to spell, et cetera, et cetera. If a school's not really big on teaching those foundational skills, and some are and some aren't, or the teachers don't know that information well and don't know how to teach it well, especially for kids who are struggling learning it, that usually is going to have a cumulative effect over time.
Right.
So I guess the other thing I will say is there are secondary consequences of dyslexia. So in other words, you can have great comprehension skills and do pretty well, again, up until usually middle school. But then all of a sudden, the secondary consequences, which are my vocabulary isn't growing, my comprehension skills aren't developing, because we know that you have to practice reading comprehension to get better at it. And our kids with dyslexia don't like to read because it's hard. And they're not developing those that metacognition that's required when you read.
Okay, right. That makes sense.
So long-winded answer, I know, but it's complicated.
Right. So again, parents shouldn't be kind of sidetracked because their kids do seem to be comprehending the material because, it could cost them time.
Yeah.
All right. We have an understood community, Margie. I think you've come into it a few times. And a lot of parents, by the way, if you haven't joined the community, you can by going to u.org/community, where parents and experts give support to each other, so consider joining. But I do want to say that a lot of parents in our community are very concerned because of spelling. So can you talk a little bit more about, the relationship between spelling and decoding? Do all kids with dyslexia have difficulty spelling? And is spelling remediated in the same way as reading would be?
Yeah, so again, it's an important question. I would say that 90% plus students with dyslexia have problems with spelling, and they might have ongoing problems with spelling. So that's just, again, related to the fact that they have trouble hearing those sounds. So part of it is driven by, I'm not hearing all the sounds in the words clearly. It's also driven by not having this explicit instruction. So one of the reasons, so a lot of times people will say, well, why bother teaching these kids spelling? They're not going to ever be good spellers. You said it yourself. Well, one of the reasons is, there are two really important reasons. One is decoding and encoding, which is the opposite of decoding, right? Which is also referred to as spelling, are reciprocal skills. Linnea Airy refers to them as two sides of the same coin. They bootstrap each other. When you work on decoding, it helps encoding. When you work on encoding, it helps decoding, because you're going, decoding words, you're blending the sounds, right? That's a blending task. Spelling words, you're segmenting the sounds, so that's a segmentation task. But they really do work hand in glove, and they support one another greatly. So that's one reason why we have to teach spelling explicitly. The second reason is that you want kids to be able to get close enough to the spelling of the word so that when they type it and the red squiggly line comes under it, the spell checker recognizes, oh, they're trying to spell favorite or whatever the word is. And they got close enough that they can predict the word from the spelling that the student wrote. Usually it's what they hear phonetically, right? And they just didn't learn the actual spelling patterns. So I hope that explains.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, it's hand in hand. I know when I would do, tutoring or whatever, we wouldn't work on spelling because it really was embedded in the reading program. So yes, absolutely. And
one other thing I would quickly, sorry to just interject this, but a lot of teachers teach spelling kind of as a separate subject, and they teach it in the context of content learning. So they teach, they might teach, about, I don't know, the rainforest, and they're going to teach canopy, and they're going to teach, whatever the words associated with that theme or that topic. And the students might remember the spelling for a day or 2 days, but they tend to forget because they're complex words. So it's okay to show them how the word is spelled, but it wouldn't be appropriate to ask kids to memorize the spelling of those words because it's not connected to that decoding instruction they might be receiving.
Okay, great. We have time for one more question, Margie, and it has come from one of our viewers. It's a good question. She wants to know whether there are specific tests or assessments to help determine whether a child has dyslexia. And then she has another question about whether there are varying forms of dyslexia. So types of assessments, and are there different kinds of dyslexia?
Okay, so the assessment question, I'll start with that since that was your first question. There is no one test for dyslexia. I think everyone agrees with that. But are there certain things that you want to be looking for and testing? Certainly, as I mentioned at the beginning of this chat, phonological processing is usually an underlying problem. So you want to check that. And there's one test that really does, I think, the most complete job of testing that is a standardized test called the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing. if you want to monitor a student's progress on that, you might use something like the PAST. It's a phonological awareness screening test that's been around for a long time. So that is one piece of the puzzle that needs to be looked at. Another is obviously how accurately and automatically are they at reading words. And there's several tests out there to measure that. Achievement tests usually do measure word recognition skills, so you want to know what those skills are. Also, how they do with contextual reading, so you want to make sure you're testing how they're reading that connected text. Spelling is also something that's very important to look at, because you can tell a lot about what the student knows about the language, going back to what we talked about earlier. So it's complicated. There's not a simple answer to assessing, but you really do want to look at a range of things. And rapid naming, which is part of the comprehensive test, the CTOP, is also something that we want to know what the processing speed, working memory, those are also aspects that may or may not be in part of the dyslexia. They're not always. So going back to the second question, actually, that's a good segue. So are there different types of dyslexia? Usually what you see is, again, this underlying problem with phonology, with the processing of the sounds, and then it's really mapping those sounds to the letters. That is part of the student with dyslexia's difficulty. Because English is complicated, as I mentioned before, we have so many sounds that can be represented many different ways in spelling. So just understanding, is that the root of, usually that's the root cause of the problem for the student with dyslexia. The two additional components that I mentioned quickly are processing speed, which again may or may not be a factor, but if a student is slow at processing all information, it's not just reading, it's usually processing any information, that's just going to mean that they're going to be slow at reading. Their reading fluency is going to be slow, and that's okay. Just important to know that. And it's going to take them longer to do everything. Learning is going to take longer. Math facts, writing, even, just walking sometimes is slower. Okay, so processing speed. And the second one I was mentioning is phonological memory. Verbal, it's also called verbal short-term memory. Some people call it working memory. But that memory component, which again impacts all learning, and if a student has difficulty with working memory, that's something to be aware of. And while we can't change a person's working memory, there are certain things that we can do as we're teaching them these skills to help support the difficulties they have with working memory.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for such a great answer. So that is all the time we have today. Thank you once again, Margie, for being with us. It's been a great session.
You're most welcome.
And I want to
everyone out there.
Yes, and I do want to remind our viewers. In fact, I was going to say it after your last answer because you had so much information in there. If you've missed any portion of this chat, or you'd like to watch parts of it again to jot down some information, please know that we archive all of our chats at u.org/calendar. So once again, Margie, thank you for being here, and thank you to our viewers for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon.